One can look at one's Twitter feed or watch the presidential debates to understand how dark things are right now in US America. But if the old cliche is true, that it is darkest before the dawn, we're in for a transformation. Two religious academic professionals are working to bring that into being. They say in a new book that we are at a turning point in American history, and we can continue down a path of exclusion, bigotry, hatred, and fear, or as a nation, quote, summon our better angels and reclaim some of the basic human values of goodness, inclusion, fairness, love, forgiveness, humility, compassion, and justice. How to help the USA rediscover its moral compass and find its spiritual center is the focus of their new book, The World is About to Turn, Mending a Nation's Broken Faith. Paul O. Ingram is Professor of Religion Emeritus at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington. He's also the author of Buddhist-Christian Dialogue in the Age of Science, Wrestling with God and Wrestling with the Ox, a Theology of Religious Experience. Reverend Dr. Rick Rouse has taught practical theology at both the undergrad and grad level in the US and Germany. He's a popular conference speaker and serves as a parish consultant, working with congregations in the areas of strategic planning, spiritual discernment, and leadership. A certified spiritual director and ordained Lutheran pastor for 45 years, he served congregations in Arizona, California, Oregon, and Washington. Gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for your time, and more importantly, for your good work on behalf of a hopeful outcome for this country in our dark time. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
How did this book come to be?
You answer that, Rick.
Well, I'll start and Paul can chime in. We were responding to the polarization of our country, especially after the 2016 elections. And we believe that weaponizing of religion is largely responsible for the direction that we've gone. The use of religion to demonize and exert control over others. For example, to justify slavery in a culture based on systemic racism, to tell women what they can and cannot do with their bodies, and to condemn certain lifestyle choices. We felt that this was not the direction we wanted to go as a country, and we wanted to find a way forward. Paul?
Yeah, and we also wanted to include the reality of religious pluralism in the mix, that this is not a Christian country. It's a multi-religious country. According to Luther, there's no such thing as a Christian nation anyway. People can be Christians, but nations can't. And if you live by a Christian vision, it's one of interdependence with all human beings, and in fact, with the life forms with which we share this planet. It involves, in spite of the fact of Christian hostility toward the world's religions, we're called to be in dialogue with the world's religions, and dialogue has to be part of this conversation, or nothing will happen. So that's where I come at this conversation.
What is it like co-authoring a book? I mean, how does one write it and the other one take a look and edit it? Or tell us about your process.
Well,
that's a good
fun.
Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I mean, when Rick invited me to look at some of the stuff he'd been writing before we put it into chapters, and asked me to make some comments, and all of a sudden he asked me to contribute to the book. So we began looking at the various topics. We read each other's chapters and made suggestions. I wrote mostly in the last 3 chapters of the book, and Rick did the primary stuff in the first chapters of the book. But we talked back and forth and shared ideas, and we co-edited everything when we were submitting to press. And it's been a very positive relationship for me, and it is a very easy one to do professionally.
I think it was made easier because, first of all, we were both colleagues at Pacific Lutheran University for about 11 years.
Yeah.
So we knew and respected one another. We were delighted to find that we were both retiring in Mukilteo and started having coffee together, and we dreamed up this book project that we felt was very important and things needed to be said. And then we both have written books. We're both experienced authors, so we knew what it took to be disciplined in writing a book and to rely on one another's expertise.
Well, it works very well. However you did it, it reads as if one person wrote it, and it's a beautiful document. I mean,
That's what we tried to do. Yeah.
yeah, and there's a tremendous amount of wisdom and just such basic information that people ought to have, and I commend you. In the preface, there are two notions that bear discussion right off the bat, and probably the second one more important. I alluded to that in my introduction, but the first is the impact of postmodernism on normative visions we have used to manage difference, and two, the end of Christendom. And you get into that later in the book too. It's a time of living in a post-Christian nation. So take the first one on, the impact of postmodernism on normative visions we have used to manage difference. If you can unpack that, I'd be grateful.
Go ahead, Paul. I'll punt that ball into your corner.
Modernism is a philosophy, a Western philosophy based on the Western Enlightenment. It starts with Descartes, that splits the world up into all kinds of dualities, good, bad, and so on. And that using the mind, using reason, you can ferret out of nature what's true about it and what's not. And you can then build a philosophy on that will answer all your questions, including the religious ones. So a modernist theology, modernist philosophy is one that assumes basically Descartes' subject-object dualism. Postmodernism sees things in a more interdependent way. It says that what things are is a result of a whole maze of interdependent relationships, most of which we're not aware of. And so you need to look at those, try to ferret those out, try to see how those are at work in you. And if everything's the result of interdependent relationships, including the universe itself, this is something that developed since physics started looking at time going backwards. If everything's interdependent, it means we're all relations. We're all brothers and sisters, including the animals and the stars and everything else. So we need to see things from that relationship, that interdependent relationships. I'm not myself, whatever that is not separate from Rick's self or my wife's self or my neighbor's dog's self or the self of a tree or the universe itself. Everything's mixed together if we're all star stuff, as Carl Sagan would have it. So that's how I look at it.
Or as the former president, Barack Obama, would have said, you didn't build that bridge, right?
That's right.
We built that bridge.
That's right.
That's right. That's right.
So it sounds a lot to me like Huayan Buddhism, the interdependent co-origination of the universe.
It is. Now I accepted the Christian doctrine of creation. I think there was a beginning, although there may not have been a beginning from what the scientists are now saying. But at any rate, God was involved in it in some way. But I also think the Buddhist doctrine of independence co-origination is absolutely spot on. And they're not contrary ideas. If God's the creator of everything, God puts God's self into everything. It's kind of like, think of Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel, okay? And when you look at that piece of art, you're seeing Michelangelo incarnating himself into that piece because it couldn't have happened without him, okay? And that doesn't mean he's reducible to the art. He's more than the art, okay? But to do anything creative, you have to, or destructive, you incarnate yourself into that object. You become part of that thing, that event. And it's, and you don't do that alone. You do that in concert with everything going on around you. Michelangelo was an artist, but he didn't work alone.
You're describing the concept of Alfred North Whitehead's prehension there, which you allude to in the book.
I'm a Whiteheadian, so that's why I do that. Yeah.
And then the end of Christendom, a post-Christian nation. I mean, just saying those, I can imagine if it were ever tweeted, I could get hate tweets directed at me if I had any following, but I don't. So maybe
well, you will on the religious right. There's no question.
Yeah. Well, I think that anybody that is looking at the polls in terms of people who are I guess claiming to be Christian, and we can look at the Pew research, that those numbers continue to go down in this country. You know, it used to be that we'd say that this is the majority of people would claim to be of a Christian background. That number now is going down to 50% or less, and the number of other religions is going up, but also the number of people who are checking the box non-affiliated, none of the above, is now close to 25% in this country. It doesn't mean that they don't believe in God, but they don't necessarily attach themselves to a Christian doctrine. Now, I found it very interesting from, and it's in the book, that in doing some research, that when Napoleon Bonaparte took over in France, it was a very Catholic country, and there was a lot of abuse and persecution of Protestants and Jewish people. And one of the first things that he did was to claim, and I think rightly so, that France has no future only as a Catholic nation, that we have to embrace our brothers and sisters of other faith traditions. And one of the first things he did was to authorize the building of Protestant churches and Jewish synagogues. And I guess that's one of the things that we're saying, that there's no future for America only as a Christian nation. Our future is interdependent with our brothers and sisters of other faith traditions and those of no tradition.
When you talk about the Pew research, you're talking about a firm called Pew, but it might also be looking at the numbers of empty pews in a given church. So
that's very true as well.
Yeah, and also the aging nature of congregations and what happens to these places, these churches. In a place like Seattle, where the spiritual but not religious is probably higher than the average, you know, these places, these churches are likely to be turned into condominium sites and what have you. So it's interesting.
Well, Washington is the most unchurched area of the United States. They've had studies on that. Fewer people go to attend a service, a Christian service here than anywhere else in the country. One thing, the founders were Enlightenment thinkers, but one of the things they did that has a postmodern ring to it is the separation of church and state. You can't be a Christian country. Now, but there were a lot of people who said that, including Martin Luther. People can be Christians, countries can't, because there's too much going on that forces people to behave in non-Christian ways. John Calvin thought you could have a Christian country if you followed his teachings, you know, but that idea is that we're open to all things in a kind of a communal dialogue is one of the things I like about what the founders' visions was. And I think that's fairly true. I don't know how many historians would agree with me on that, but it seems to me they were looking into the future when they said separation of church and state.
Mm-hmm. And to back up your statement there, that a nation can't be Christian, you get into what you call incarnational theology. And it would seem to me that would be sort of where someone would look for you to see how you would go about saying something like that. There can't be a Christian nation, because it has to be a person incarnated in the world who acts in such a way as having the experience of faith that makes them a Christian.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's get in a little bit into some of the early material in the book. You yourselves asked the question, how did religion in America get so distorted? You talk about the racism of European elites, and then of course we get into the religious right. You don't mention by name people like Jerry Falwell in that, but those are the people from who I immediately associate, and his son, who was recently defrocked, or whatever you might call it, from Liberty University. So tell us about the source of the distortion of religion in this country.
Well, I think it goes back to, again, the Euro-American white Christians who came over to this country during the time of the explorers, and exercising what's called the doctrine of discovery, which was authorized actually by papal decree by Pope Gregory, and it was intended to give license basically to the nations of Northern Europe and Southern Europe to go into countries where there were no Christians, to civilize supposedly the countries, take the land, to even enslave the people, because the people were considered to be property, along with whatever other resources that they could find in these new lands. It was the beginning of colonialization, and these empires were built on this whole concept of the doctrine of discovery. And I think as we think about, we could go into detail about how that has influenced both the founding of this country, but also how this nation has evolved, and even the current, what I call the last gasp of white supremacy in this country. That I think much of it has to do with our image of God. Is it a God of the Euro-American white Christian who sides with a superior race, giving permission to take land, destroy the environment, and abuse people who are different? Or is it the God of people who are on the margin, who stands for compassion, justice, and equality? Is it a white European Jesus, or is it a Middle East Jesus of color? I think we've set ourselves up with these kind of dichotomies. And there are a lot of people that want to hang on to a white Jesus or a white Savior, and say, this is who gives me the permission and authority to maintain my white privilege.
I'm reminded of an advertising campaign in Seattle a couple of years ago, where bus boards and maybe some billboards said Jesus is, and then there was a blank, and then somebody spray painted or painted in the words Middle Eastern. So,
there you go. There you go.
So that to me was graffiti that just sticks in my mind.
Well, how many of us grew up with those? We're Christian, and we're Lutherans, and we grew up with a kind of Norwegian type Jesus in our sanctuaries.
Well, it's a good thing that the communion didn't involve lutefisk, I guess.
Absolutely. Lessa would have been okay, but not lutefisk.
Occasionally, yeah.
You write that the division in U.S. American politics is reflected in the earlier Christian paradigm versus the one you see emerging from belief-centered to transformational-centered. Can you talk about that and the evidence you see of it?
Go ahead, Paul. You can have the first shot.
It's when you look at the stories about the historical Jesus. This was a man who was living out the prophetic vision of his time. And the best summary of that I can think of is Micah 6:6-8. What does God require of you? That you do justice, practice compassion, and work for solidarity of community. Now that's based on my translations of 3 Hebrew words that are in there. Justice demands a kind of interdependent relationship with other people, where you see that the suffering of another person is your suffering. That's modeled by the historical Jesus, incidentally, okay? And compassion, chesed in Hebrew, compassion is the experience of another person's happiness or hope or suffering as if it were your own, and the willingness to do something to help that, do something about that, which may or may not be what that person wants you to do, because you're trying to struggle for justice. Justice means creating a community, a solidarity of community, where people have what they need for meaningful existence and survival. Okay? And that's what the prophets are talking about. And I think that's what Jesus was talking about. And that's what he's essentially, in his own words, and he died for it, he got killed for it, because the powerful authorities in the world don't want a bunch of religious hippies wandering around talking about compassionate justice, because you get too many people going against the establishment that way. So it's a radical viewpoint. If you live by just compassionate wisdom, okay, compassionate justice in solidarity of community, you can't live like everybody else. It means you go against the norms when they have to be gone against. You stand in that picket line when you have to. You don't obey unjust laws, even if you go to jail. So this is what's involved in just compassionate community. And I think the model for that is the historical Jesus. And Christians are called upon to follow that. That's what makes you a follower of Jesus or a Christian. Now, I probably push that further than most people are willing to do. But for me, that's where it starts.
Well, and it's not accepting the status quo. It's being willing to be transformational.
That's right.
Acting for justice where there is no justice. Acting out of compassion for those on the margin. It's all about the healing of the world, not about the saving of myself.
Yeah, it's not about me. So
It might be wearing a yarmulke in a demonstration in Sweden, even if you're not Jewish, to show solidarity when Jewish people there are under attack by.
That's right.
That's
one example that we use in the book. That's right.
Or it might mean when Trump decided he wanted all Muslims to sign in as Muslims in their local police departments, that Christians, and I said this in my church, we should march down with him and sign our names as Muslims, because it makes absolute sense. If you look at the word Islam means to surrender to God's will, and you hear the Lord's Prayer, and you hear, thy will be done, not mine. And you hear in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus, knowing he's going to be murdered, say, not my will, but yours, I'll do it.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
It reminds me, sidebar here, of Joe Biden saying inshallah in a presidential debate.
That's right. That's right. And I've walked in demonstrations with Muslims, and I've gone to synagogues wearing my yarmulke. I was invited even to read a passage in Hebrew at my sister-in-law's wedding, who was Lutheran, is now a Jewish woman. And that was the most fun time I ever had. If you haven't been to a Jewish wedding, you haven't had fun.
Just this past year, I was lifted up in a chair as the father of the bride, and it's an
All
experience
right.
I'll never
There we
forget.
go.
Congratulations.
Yes, mazel tov, they might say. Thank you. Where is the justice on page 39? Now, of course, I'm reading from a manuscript which needed to be proofed, and I'm grateful to have had this material to prepare for the interview. But I would love it if someone, whoever feels motivated to read, where is the justice when people are unable to worship without fear? It's essentially the second full paragraph on page 39. So if you could take a look at that and read that very meaty paragraph, people will get a sense, I think, of the tone, the quality of the writing, and a major gist of the book and what drives you.
I'm looking in the actual book.
So am I. I can't seem to find it.
Where is the justice when people are unable to worship without fear, whether it be in a mosque, a temple, or a church?
Here we go. Yeah, I'll continue. Where is the justice when thousands of refugees must flee their countries of origin because of war, famine, or persecution, only to be warehoused indefinitely in holding camps? Where is the justice when working class women and men see the value of their wages shrink while the rich become wealthier? Where is the justice when we see our land scarred and water polluted by greedy corporations? Where is the justice when 60% of the prison population in this country is made up of African Americans? Where is the justice if millions of US citizens in the richest country of the world do not have access to health care? Where is the justice when hundreds of migrant children are taken from their parents and kept in unsanitary conditions?
Amen. Very, very, very well said. And, you know, when we think about this postmodern era and we think about diversity, when we think about, you know, in my neighborhood, seeing Muslim women and men walking down the street, a prospect that I think scares a lot of people on the religious right, they might attribute it to changing times. But you write in the book about how the Bible or the Hebrew scriptures are a lot more reflective of diversity than we now would give that era credit for being. Daniel 7, 13 and 14, 1 John 4, 7 through 21 are the two biblical passages that you cite. Can you talk about that diversity as it was expressed 2,000 years ago?
Well, I mean, if you lived in Jesus's time, you would have seen diversity. Even in Jerusalem, you would have seen, because it's a trade center, people are coming again in and out all the time. There are people from Israel who were not considered Jews by the people in Jerusalem, you know, because they had the temple and all this other stuff. They had the Romans in town. It was a quite pluralistic society. And one of the things that bothered the priesthood in the Jerusalem temple was how to keep people loyal to the Torah, and they had their own way of doing it. You have to do these sacrifices in the temple. You have to wear all this kind of. They had rules, but most people ignored the rules, even people who were Jews. Okay, so the diversity's always been there, but it was never dealt with. Seeing diversity as something to be celebrated is kind of a new thing, in my opinion. But it reflects the biblical tradition. All kinds of nice things happen. I remember when one of the I won't mention his name, business people in the Mukilteo community sent a postcard to all the residents at his own expense without his name on it, saying, we better watch out because the Muslims are going to build a mosque here in Mukilteo and they're all terrorists. We need to protest against this. I was so angry. So I jumped up and went to the police department, complained, saw the mayor and complained, and then my church got cooking. We organized a series of community meetings where we invited our Muslim brothers and sisters to our church and people in the community to come, and they were going to hear about Islam and answer their questions. We had 3 such meetings. I gave a little homily on Islam, talked about its basic teachings and ideas. I didn't want to do it, but the Muslims wanted me to. Another Lutheran pastor, Terry Kylo, who's leading the same kind of effort from the Lutheran perspective more widely than I did, who was also one of my students, is doing the same thing. And Mukilteo has kind of changed a bit. Muslims are finally, the city council tried to stop them from building that mosque by putting all kinds of legal barriers in the way. But the community just keeps on keeping on, and they finally got approval, finally got their water things all hacked up. They're going to start building fairly soon, is what I've been told.
I suspect that Jamal Rahman had a hand in this.
No, he didn't have a hand in that, but Riaz Khan did, and he's now on our city council and doing all kinds of things. Now, most of the Muslims here are South Asian Muslims from India, South Asia, and so on. There are a few from the Middle East, but it's a fairly lively community. And
but through the writing of our book, Jamal has become a good friend.
yeah, so Jamal has become a great friend, and he mentioned to me that he was very proud of the Mukilteo effort. So
excellent. Liberation theology is discussed in the book, page 64, and we see how that was dealt with by the Reagan administration and the graduates of the School of the Americas, and the carnage wrought by those efforts. In fact, we're now paying the price with these countries having many, many difficulties.
We've lost your audio.
oh, I have it. You lost my audio?
No, I lost Paul's audio.
Can you hear me now?
Well, I'm talking about liberation theology
Got it.
and how it was discussed in the book on page 64. And we know, for those of us who are alive and we're witnesses and we're watching this, how liberation theology and the efforts in Central America were dealt with by the Reagan administration and the School of the Americas, and the carnage that school wrought, and all the people who are leaving those countries, because we've created a very difficult place for hundreds of thousands of people to live. And we're now paying the price with people coming to our borders and wanting to get away from the carnage that the United States created in the first place. Your take on contemporary Christianity seems to have a lot in common with liberation theology. And I went back to my old Ernesto Cardinal books just to get a taste of that. So, who, by the way, I learned through this process, studied with Thomas Merton, another person mentioned in your book.
Mm-hmm.
So, is liberation theology a guide? Is that accurate? Talk to us about that.
Well, I think my favorite teacher was a guy named John Cobb, and he's the founder of what we call process theology, and that's very much a form of liberation theology as well. And so, yes, authentic Christian theology has to be a liberation theology. It has to look for the welfare of all human beings, for justice and compassion. And it has to stand up against those forces that prevent that. Reagan in that time of that era was one of the evidence I could cite about why not only is this country not a Christian country, no country can be a Christian country. No nation can be.
Right. Also in the book, page 67, the first step toward humility is to bear witness to the truth, to admit our own failings as a nation, and the ongoing extrajudicial executions by police of people like George Floyd, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, and thousands more, is one. These are several opportunities to admit the truth, to bear witness. The treatment of indigenous cultures, another. I say this speaking on the ancestral homeland of the Duwamish, the Muckleshoot, and other coastal Salish tribes. The effort in many places to have those kinds of statements made before events, recognition that we are on the ancestral homeland of certain indigenous peoples. There's even a website you can type in your address and find out on whose ancestral homeland you're engaged. It seems like this kind of knowledge is far away. We are far away from that first step toward humility in U.S. America in late October 2020.
Oh, absolutely. It's because of our sense of superiority that, you know, we are somehow able to justify who we are because of where we've come from. Those of us that claim to be, you know, Northern European, we have a lot to repent for in this nation. You know, not only for what we did in terms of the genocide of the Native Americans, the enslavement of African Americans, and the list goes on, but for what's going on today, and you've given us a litany. You know, I take heart from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that took place in South Africa, for example, where Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela said there's no future for this country unless we face up to the atrocities that we have witnessed, unless we can come together and spell out the truth and repent of who we are. And I've seen that now in Australia and Canada, where there's been, and we cite this in the book, where there's been an effort on the part of both the church and the government, but led by the church, to say we need to repent for what we've done to the Native people, the First Nation people in Australia and in Canada. And they've used the Truth and Reconciliation model. All we have done, there's a couple of statements that were made by the Seattle Council of Churches, you know, as a first effort, kind of recognizing the fact that we have taken advantage of the Native people here in the Northwest. I mean, that's a first step, but we have a long way to go to actually repent for all that we have done to hurt people in this country, whether it's the Native people or people of color. The redlining that's continuing to take place in terms of the African American and other people of color, in terms of the housing issues. And, you know, I have to say, when Trump stood in Michigan at his rally and said to the women in the suburban area, well, got rid of the housing equality laws because I wanted to make your suburbs a safe place for you. What does that say about who we are as a nation?
Well, it doesn't reflect well, and that's why I read this. I'm hopeful of it, and I wonder, is the world I'm living in radically detached from the world that I see represented in things like the presidential debate that I watched part of last night, and I wonder if, in fact, the USA is not going to be a Christian nation going forward. What will the ethos be? Do you have any idea? Is it a pantheistic thing that you discuss? I see you two as pretty visionary people. I hear you echoing things from Muslim culture, from Jewish culture, Taoist references in the book. We've talked about Huayan Buddhism. So your vision appears to be very pantheistic, and
I would say panentheistic. Pantheism is a position that everything is God. Okay, the classical Hindu idea is the idea that Brahman, the sacred, is Atman, your deepest self, are identical. And so the function of going to a temple is to apprehend in the deity you worship as an avatar, the connection between it and you, your deepest self, and Brahman, have an experience of unity with Brahman. I prefer the word panentheist. It means God is in, with, and under, but all things and events, but not all things and events embody the fullness of God. So when Lutherans have communion, when we serve the wine, we step right into panentheism. God is in, with, and under the elements of communion, but the wine and the bread are separate, non-dual. You and I are incarnations of this deity that's in, with, and under everything. It's part of who we are, but I'm not God. Now, if I can recognize that connection in other people, I will relate to them accordingly. But I can't do it if I live in a dualistic universe, which says we're always separate. And we just do the right thing because some external law tells me what to do. So panentheism is the basic position theologically that I find myself in. I can't speak for Rick, but I suggest we're brothers in the same theological cloth at this point.
Excellent.
And I would say in a more maybe concise way that the future of this country is where we can live together with common values that are reflected in the world religions, such as the Golden Rule, such as, love your neighbor, have compassion for one another, do justice. It's those simple but profound values that we can all live by and claim as a moral center. But it takes an effort to go beyond ourselves and recognize again the interdependence that we are all together in this venture, that it's not about me, it's not about Paul, it's about us together and how do we move forward together. Mm-hmm. It's about the common good.
Mm-hmm. You write on page 92 that, quote, almost all ancient philosophies and religious ways paid scant attention to the interdependence of social justice. I read that quote and I think to ask you, is this part of why we're being run by a failed businessman and reality TV show host who tested the Peter Principle with predictable results? Is this why young people are turned off by religion? Look at the marches in Seattle. Young people are fed up with it.
Yes.
Well, they're fed up with that kind of religion. But whenever I talked about this stuff with my students, they were really inquisitive and attentive because they had not heard much of that before, and some of them followed their inclinations accordingly, and wound up. Some of them became pastors when they didn't think never crossed their mind to do so. Some of them became writers. Some of them did all kinds of things, but they bring this vision with them, and it's a slow change. But that's how it's done, so I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Well, what makes sense is you've got I think it's a 10-step program, chapter 7, for people who want to wake up, I would put it. One of which, number 4, is to assess your degree of prejudice or openness to others.
Yes.
Talk to us about that whole program, and specifically that. I'm reminded of the current phrase, check your privilege.
Yes, exactly. Well, we talk about, the only way forward is to embrace diversity, and it begins with understanding my own prejudice. How do I view others? And there's kind of a continuum. Is it something that, do I just tolerate differences, or can I embrace differences? So there's a certain level, and, we cite a particular, I'm blanking on her name right now. Looking at the, she's a, here we go. the intercultural continuum, a way to assess one's tendency to discriminate or judge those who are different. And it shows a progression from a monocultural mindset to an intercultural mindset. And we like the work of Helen Fagan, who builds on the work of Milton Bennett, in showing how one can bridge behavior across cultural differences. And we talk about how, Fagan, in her work with medical students, that their ability to understand their level of cultural competence impacts the way they approach a patient's cultural differences. And it says that the more that they are able to understand their own prejudice and where they fit on this cultural continuum, the more they can grow in terms of their own, what they call cultural competence, and their ability to receive, accept, and embrace cultural differences.
Sounds holistic and it sounds radical to me. Both two things I use in a very positive way. You say late in the book that the soul of a nation and the integrity of faith are now at stake. Are you optimistic for a positive outcome? Doesn't justice always prevail?
Not always.
Well, I like what Martin Luther King said, that that history swings towards justice eventually. And I'd like to think that that's the case. If we look at, again, look at the polls and where this country is going, the country has moved more to the left because of the current president. And, I think certainly the base is solidified, but the base is what, 35% of the country. The majority of people in this country have actually moved to a more progressive understanding in terms of justice issues, social issues, equality, care for the neighbor. And it's interesting that as the nation moves further to the left, we have a Supreme Court moving further to the right. And I think that's going to set up a really interesting conflict of values in this country in the years ahead. I'm hopeful in terms of the election that we can regain a moral center with the new president and a new administration that is concerned about regaining a moral center for this country.
Tikkun Magazine's email came out this morning and was entitled "Sending Trump to Hell" by Ariel Dorfman. I don't know if you've seen that.
No.
It's well done. I can forward it to you if you like.
Love it. Love to see it.
But I want to ask you this. For those who watch this and maybe went to church as a kid and don't consider themselves spiritual but not religious, as men of faith, what does it mean to go to hell? Is Trump headed there? And what does that mean for his eternal soul? Can you speak to that?
Well, they say that hell is the absence of God. Hell is the absence of love, of compassion, of care. I don't believe that hell is necessarily a physical place.
Yeah, I don't either.
But it's a void. It's a place of absence. And I certainly wouldn't want to go there.
Would you say it's a place where Trump lives right now? I mean, I don't mean the White House. I mean in a state of what we would have been taught was hell.
I don't know how to judge that. I think he's going to wind up being all alone by himself somewhere, and having to rethink all this stuff. I think he's getting close to being in that state of emptiness because he keeps, he's illogical. He can't think straight. He wants to force people into doctrines and so on. He's a very authoritarian guy.
Well, and he seeks constant adoration.
And he seeks constant adoration, and he's losing it.
in order to feel value, he has to put down others and seek
Yeah.
adoration from others. It's
According to one of his daughters who doesn't like him, he even puts down his own children, including the ones, his daughter and son and son-in-law, all the time. So, you know, when he's gone, they're not going to be mourning for him. He's just making himself empty. So I think hell is a kind of emptiness. It's the absence of fullness, the absence of relationships that make life, the absence of relationship that makes life alive.
And we see that in the lack of vitality and just the physical state, which doesn't look good. I could probably interview you guys for another hour, but I suspect that you have other things to do, and I'm really grateful for the time that you've given me today. And I'm really grateful for your work. It's great to get caught up with you, Paul, after having interviewed you 20 years ago.
What a pleasant surprise.
Yeah.
Tell him what he interviewed me when the Society for Buddhist-Christian Studies had their international conference at BLU in 2000.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So I had good memories of that, and it's great to see what you've done in 20 years and how fine a point you're putting on all this research and all this dedication. It's really an honor.
Feels like I've just gotten older.
Well, it beats the alternative, I guess.
Yes, it does.
Well, thank you, Paul, for the opportunity that we've had to share with you today and with your listeners.
Yeah, Paul, it's been a pleasure.
The world is about to turn.com is the website, and Rick Rouse and Paul Ingram have been my guests. Brothers, thanks for your time and continued success.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Paul.
Be well.
Blessings.